My name is Deborah Keyek-Franssen. I'm the Associate Vice President for Digital Education and Engagement at the University of Colorado System. It's my pleasure to moderate this session on why hips matter and where we need more evidence. Rebecca, if you could pass over the, what's it called, the remote control to me, then I can start to move the slides, I believe.
Deb, go ahead and request it from her.
Oh, there we go. I'll request that. Click to start the remote control. All right, there we go. So again, welcome. It is our pleasure to have Jillian Kinzie here today. She is a well-known scholar. I'm sure you've read many of her publications and her books, and we are just very grateful to have her there, have her with us today, talking about why hips matter and where we need more evidence. So I just wanted to remind everybody that this is an interactive session. It will also be recorded. In fact, it's being recorded already, including what you put into the chat. So you might want to use professional discretion about what you put in the chat. You should know, if you can see that big blue ball in the background of Jillian's video feed, that is not just decorative, that she also uses it for her yoga practice. We're hoping that she doesn't have to go off and stretch in the middle of this session because we've peppered her with too many questions, although she is ready to answer any of the questions that you may have. I'll be curating questions throughout the session, and at the end we will have a Stump the Jillian session at the end where your questions will be answered. I just wanted to let you know that thank you in advance for filling out those survey questions as part of the registration. I did a quick and dirty, I should say, it's quick and dirty evaluation of it. And pretty much these are some of the challenges that you have listed, including the need for more evidence and assessment. Faculty buy-in came as something, another issue that you have that might be preventing the scaled adoption of hips around. Funding was also another challenge, as was, it's interesting, initiative fatigue came up several times. And so if you want to comment on any of those in the chat, please do. But again, this gave a really good overview of what some of the issues you have on your campuses. So this is the structure of the webinar. I'll be turning it over to Jillian in just a moment. She's going to cover what we already know about hips. There will be an interactive break, and that's when you come into play. You're the star of the show. Jillian will then cover addressing new challenges. There will be another interactive break, and then it will be Stump the Jillian session. So please do add questions for Jillian in the chat, or if you wish, you can send them to me privately in the chat. So what we'd like to do, just to test to make sure you know how to use that chat, is for you to tell us where you are in the hips, in the development of your high impact practices initiative. And so I just didn't want to use the usual Likert, so it is going to be a pictorial Likert. Are you A, in the egg stage, B, in the caterpillar or pupa stage, C, in the chrysalis stage, or D, have you already emerged fully as a beautiful butterfly? So if you could please just write in the chat where you are, oh, that would be great. And I'm sorry, I just did something terrible. I just stopped the slideshow. There we go. And I will try. Oh, good. We've got A, C, Ds. So we do have a lot of butterflies in there. That is fantastic. Thank you. Keep those coming. And now it's my pleasure to turn over to Jillian. And Jillian, you'll just have to I'm going to return the remote control, and if you could accept that from Rebecca, I'm going to mute now, and I'll just let you have at it.
Well, thanks, Deborah, and thanks to everybody. I really appreciate your interest in, and we have a wonderful group of folks who have joined us today, and I again want to thank you for your participation.
Jillian, I think you're on mute.
Oh, am I? Oh, that's...
I hear her.
Oh, you can hear her. Okay, it's me.
Okay.
I'll go on mute now.
Okay, all right. Well, good. Phew, I was wondering. There weren't any other options. Okay, so glad again that you provided plenty of questions for this session. And what I've done is to try and address them via the slides that I'm going to go over as much as I can. But believe it or not, the questions that were posed and your requests for evidence and comments about the obstacles that you are encountering is actually more than what I could possibly address in slides. So that tells me something about how much work we have to do around high impact practices. But I'm really glad to be with you, and I want to acknowledge kind of what got us here. And actually what got us to this point of offering this webinar is, while we see that high impact practices have been widely promoted and addressed as an approach, as a really successful way to improve student learning and success, what we've seen over the years is a little bit of, I wouldn't say pushback, but certainly we've seen some counter narrative that raised some questions about whether the high impact practice were worth the investment. Is it something that we can really reasonably deliver? And then the more recent questions that came from an Inside Higher Ed article is maybe high impact practices are not so high impact. That came in April based on a study that was published in the Journal of Higher Education. And then the response that George Koo and I offered on what really makes a high impact practice high impact. So in some ways, you know, the concern, the questions, the interest in high impact practice have brought us all here today and have certainly brought the NASH and the TS3 initiative to where it is widespread interest. But with that, of course, whenever there's interest in a major initiative in higher education, there are going to be questions that people raise along the way. So we're going to try and address some of those today. But I did want to acknowledge kind of how we got to this point today. So let me keep moving through these, and let's see if it's going to allow me to do that. Oh, there we go. Okay. And I just want to again kind of get to the, remind us what we're talking about. And I'm going to go through the slides at the beginning fairly quickly because I realize I'm talking to a very well-educated audience, particularly because all of you have been working on these efforts for so long now. But I just wanted to again, acquaint us to make sure we're all in the same place with what we're talking about. These are the high impact practices we're talking about, those identified through AAC&U, and also the ones that we've been able to study over the years in NSSE, which is actually a shorter list of 6 to 7 of these items that we've been able to study on the NSSE survey. But what I want to really remind us of in the beginning is the deep history and research that exists about these high impact practices. And as somebody who's been engaged in this kind of research for a long time, I really think it's important to acknowledge the deep history and research that, in fact, Lynn Swanner and Jane Brownell identified in their 2010 overview of high impact practices, where they really surveyed the landscape of these 5 particular high impact practices, the areas where they found the greatest research. So I want to acknowledge that and say that we as scholars and educators have to rely on this deep body of research to be assured of the value of HIPS. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into a couple of the areas where we actually have a substantial body of evidence, and those are notably around the first year experience and really the first year seminar. And, you know, I just have to go back to the depth of research that's available that, for example, Ernie Pascarella has done and has synthesized, that all the folks that have been long associated with the University of South Carolina and John Gardner and all the initiatives in the first college year have undertaken to demonstrate the value of first-year seminars. And you know, there's a lot of research that's available on that. The other one that I can certainly point to is the deep well of information about service learning, established in multiple journals now, and the depth of association of service learning with a variety of different outcomes. Not only success and the outcomes we're all after related to persistence and retention, but some very appropriate outcomes of service learning. For example, students developing the capacity to reflect and to feel committed to the welfare of others, and for students' ability to understand how their educational coursework affects community-based problems. All sorts of meaningful, valuable outcomes are part of that work. Same thing is true for undergraduate research. We see this same body of research. I'm pulling the example from actually now the Council for Undergraduate Research, the Kerr Quarterly, has transformed into the scholarship now of undergraduate research. This journal actually publishes regularly on the value of undergraduate research experiences related to a variety of different outcomes. One just really quick lesson or finding from this is that results, extensive studies on undergraduate research show that participation is associated with increased student success as measured by GPA. That's just one study that actually, that's from the Ruse, Grabowski, and Shun study that's featured on this slide about the value of undergraduate research. And again, greater connection to outcomes that are specific for those particular practices. So for undergraduate research, you see a lot more outcomes associated with going on to graduate school, success in subsequent courses, recognition of students' skills in conducting research, their confidence in their capacity to do research. All of those outcomes that are very specific and meaningful to the initiative itself. So I want to acknowledge all that to say that there's no shortage of research on these experiences. And let me see, okay, the slides are a little sluggish here. Okay, there we go. So the next piece I want to remind us of is some of the more widespread work that's been promoted about HIPS in general that we've all seen, that's been featured in a variety of different AAC&U publications, both in the original 2008 publication that George Koo authored, then in the subsequent one with multiple authors, and then in Ashley Finley and Tia McNair's publication on the effectiveness of HIPS for underserved students, is the value of high impact practices to very particular engagement outcomes related to deep approaches to learning and perceived students' perceptions of their gains in learning and development. So again, we have a lot of evidence to show the value of high impact practices in these associated with these outcomes and gains. And as I mentioned, Ashley Finley and Tia McNair again repeated a lot of those same findings and pointed out the particular importance that these practices have for students who are historically underserved, students who are low income, who enter the institution with lower entering board scores, and for students of color in particular. So all of this to me is pretty persuasive in terms of the body of evidence. And then we also see some single institution studies. The one I'll just illustrate is Bettina Huber's work from Cal State Northridge that we've probably all seen lots of different times in different formats, but their analysis showed the value of multiple high impact practices as having a modest enhancement to students' GPA at exit, that it actually was associated with reduced time to degree among students who entered first time full-time and are first-time, first year, and that it actually was positively associated with timely graduation. So there are these single institution studies, and in again, Cal State Northridge example, the effect that it has by studying different student groups. So in this case, Latino students, we're seeing greater participation has a benefit in HIPS. So again, lots of good single institution studies. I wanted to add a couple of new things that we've analyzed, kind of trying to, again, build the body of evidence about the relationship between multiple high impact practices. And one of the, I think, most substantive outcomes that we can examine in, at least from the database we have on NSSE, which is around students' deep learning. In this case, it's measured by their responses to questions that ask about the extent to which they've engaged in reflective and integrative learning. So using this as an outcome, we see that high impact practices have a positive effect, and the more students do them, the higher their reflective and integrative learning scores are. So again, you know, one HIP helps, 2 HIPs help, but 3 or more is even better, or more likely to be associated with students reporting reflective and integrative learning.
How can I help you?
More so than zeros. We also conducted some recent analysis that actually is about first-year student retention. So we actually, using some NSSE data, have the capacity to actually.
You have to see academic coach to put you in the new math.
Actually, I hear someone else has their microphone
They could have done it right there for you.
Someone's microphone is on.
Now we need to schedule you an appointment. Well, to do this, send me an email with a story.
Rebecca, you can mute her if you just pull up the participant list and
email address. Okay, so you're gonna go SSRI
Ari Barnes
at CCBC.
Right, I know someone's conducting very important business right now, and I appreciate their capacity. Well, actually, I envy their capacity to multitask. All right, so I want to share this.
We've all been cut off.
To unmute myself. Okay, let me. All right, I should be back on now, I believe.
You are, you're now, we can hear you now.
Excellent. So let me just add, or let me just reiterate what I said, that for those of you who could only read lips, who could understand, I was reporting on our more recent first-year student retention data, where we actually did some new analysis using some retention data that we collected associated with some of our pilot survey results. We don't normally collect retention data with NSSE, but we had it available, so we took advantage of it. This analysis just came out, and it's now featured on our website. So if you're looking for a study, you can go to our psychometric portfolio and see this predictive validity study, where we found actually certain percent increases associated with learning communities, research with faculty, and service learning, 3 high impact practices that are frequently or more frequently a part of a first-year student experience, less likely for students to have done internships or anything like that. So we just really looked at these 3. And what we saw was there's a general boost to retention for all 3. But what was more interesting was when we looked in depth and actually started to look at this across a range of, in this case, the one data point we had among entering students were their SAT scores. So we saw actually the lower, in fact, the bottom SAT quartile had a 7 percentage point increase compared to only about, our average of 3% for the whole group. And in this case, the average of 4 to 2 percentage point for the middle and top SAT groups. So all that to say that the lower, the bottom SAT quartile seems to benefit even more in terms of retention with their association with these three particular practices, and particularly learning communities and research with faculty. So those, I think, are some important new findings related to the important outcome of first-year retention that I wanted to share with you. The other, I'm going to try and make this, oh, I seem to have, there we go. Another new finding related to the other end of students' experience that we reported actually in our 2016 annual results report is associating our high impact practices, or students' participation in high impact practices, with their post-college plans. We actually instituted a new module in 2015 that asked students about their post-college plans. So seniors only were asked about what they're going to do after they graduate. And we discovered that there were two really important outcomes. That one, research with faculty and study abroad experiences were associated with plans for graduate school. So there was a positive connection there for students who indicated they were going on to graduate school. And another relationship that we saw was students who participated in any of the 6 high impact practices that are part of the NSSE survey reporting were more likely to have a new job secured, and that they were more likely to indicate that their major coursework prepared them well for post-graduation plans. So, you know, it's more evidence, I think, of the value of high impact practices, but this time on the other side about post-college plans. And I included these 2 slides because these are 2 things that several of you indicated you had some interest in learning more about evidence related to both retention and post-college plans, and we just happen to have some related to that. But I want to close out this first section of our work together just by reminding us about one of the most important findings, I think, that George Koo pointed out very early in the revealing of all of the value of high impact practices, is the salutary effects of high impact practices for underrepresented students. And that for me, this is most compelling, and I think for many people who are concerned about issues of equity and student success in higher education, this one is most compelling, and the evidence seems to continue to suggest that this is true, that when underrepresented students are involved in HIPS, it has a greater benefit. And to close out this section, I wanted to remind us of the synthesis of research and practice that was offered in the recent Change magazine article, again authored by George and Ken O'Donnell and Carol Gary Schneider, about the value of high impact practices. And you know, you can all see the different findings associated again in their synthesis, but probably the most, or at least the transition point here I want to do to get us to the next stage of our work are some of the challenges that they identified. One is, you know, we still seem to be, have a lot of work to do in terms of assuring equitable participation, and that we also have more work to do in terms of really trying to address some of the challenges to assuring that HIPS are more widespread in terms of rewarding faculty for the investment that this demands of them, and then that we need better systems for tracking HIPS at an institution level. So I want to stop there and give us a time for one of Deborah's creative interactive breaks. So I'll pause here and let's see, I think I need to give up remote control. So I will give it up. There we go.
Okay. All right, thank you. Jillian, that was fantastic. And what I'd like to do now is just have all of you reflect a little bit on what Jillian has presented already. And so what it is you have 2 minutes now. You're going to summarize the first part of Jillian's presentation in a student newspaper headline. you're going to type your headline into the chat. Mine is students demand HIPs for all, because there has been, of course, a student demonstration requesting HIPs for all students, especially for those from historically underrepresented groups. The students are just furious that they're not offered to everyone. So that is the headline after this protest. So here's another one. Students say HIPs help. So if you're in a room with people, take a moment to figure out your HIPs headline, and then we'll just watch them come up. We've got HIPs from history to present. Oh, I like this one. Cal Poly guarantees 3 HIPs for every undergraduate. A moment on the lips, a lifetime of HIPs. There we go, Linda. Having HIPs help. Oh, I like get hip. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hips, hooray. This is awesome.
Yay, Elise. Don't worry about those articles. Yeah. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Yeah.
Hips work. High hips. Hips are a powerful piece of your college career. Make sure you get one. Oh, nice. Rosy future for hips. Live what you learn and go far. Oh, I like this one. Are you hip enough? Especially if there are older adult learners there. How hip are you? The hips don't lie. Yeah, I think like when they come in one after the other, that's kind of funny. Replacement hips even for the youth.
Oh,
So,
oh God.
awesome. So I'm going to let you all continue with that. But in the meantime, we only have one question for Jillian that came through the back channel. So don't forget, we have a Stump the Jillian section at the end. So please get those questions to me either privately or in the chat, and I'll curate them. But if I only have one, my curation job is very easy. So if you could please get those questions coming. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jillian. And thank you for these. These are awesome.
Great. Thank you. Very creative. I love it. All right. So I want to get into the thick of it now and actually try and address some of the challenges that were both raised in some recent critiques. And as much as I appreciate Elise's pay no attention to those, to the naysayers approach, I do think it's important that we address this. And I will say that there are some, of course, legitimate questions that should be raised about all educational practices. However, I'll say I want them to be shared equally across all the things we do that we're, and to really get us to study all the kinds of practices and activities. So everything would be subject to the same scrutiny. So here's the probably the elephant in the room is the claim that came through that got a fair amount of attention in high impact or in the Inside Higher Education that indicated that maybe HIPs are not so high impact. And, I will acknowledge that this was a very complex analysis. It was a well-constructed study in terms of what it was trying to address. And their conclusion was that graduation rates at colleges that incorporated all the HIPs were not higher than those that used few, if any. And, a pretty simple, straightforward conclusion. And they thought this was concerning because they felt that it is important that we always raise questions about the use of practices when they perhaps come at the expense of other possible offerings. And I certainly don't think these are new concerns about any educational practice. And their ultimate conclusion was that more research is needed in order for us to wisely invest in practices. Again, something that we typically see at the end of most educational studies. So I don't really have much to say in terms of, kind of critiquing their study. I can quibble some with the quality of the data and the analytical method that was used, but I don't really think that that's worth kind of getting into at this point. I do think that the study really animated some important questions. And one of the things is a question that I think is based on one of the measures that they actually used in their study, was by asking institutions, in this case, 2 people at an institution. I don't know if they accepted an institution where there was only 1 response garnered, but they at least tried to corroborate the availability of high impact practice at an institutional level, and by a scale that indicated whether they were required of all, or required of some, or not required for anyone. So it was a fairly simple kind of measure of availability, and as well as a fairly solitary kind of one person's point of view on availability. So while I could question whether that's enough, what I really want to raise, the more important question, is just having HIPs available on campus sufficient? And no doubt you probably already get my bias here, is I don't think simply having HIPs available at an institution does much beyond what they have existed for a long time. The HIPs are available to those who choose to partake in them. Even places that have required HIPs, I think we can raise some questions about, does that really mean that everyone participates, or are there some students who are given exceptions to those? Are they targeted to students who really are not inclined to be successful in that, and it's designed as some sort of remediation for some other larger problem? So there's a whole lot of questions around what availability means that I think should both be questioned in a research design, but more importantly, in our practice of implementing HIPs. So that's one aspect. And then I think the other thing is, what outcomes really should we be linking to participation in HIPs? I certainly understand all of the significant and real interest in associating high impact practices with important outcomes like retention and graduation rates. But the hard part is whether some of those outcomes like graduation rates can we really isolate the effects of high impact practices on an outcome like graduation rates? Should we reasonably expect that a first-year seminar would have the kind of enduring effect that it would actually have an impact on a 4-year or 6-year graduation rate at both the institutional level, as this study was done at an institutional graduation rate? So I think that there are some serious concerns about how proximal should the outcome be to the experience. The greater the proximity, the sooner we can measure it, the better off I think we can capture, unless that outcome really is a long-term measure, like the person who raised the question about the Gallup study about well-being in the workplace. That is a long-term outcome measure, but I do think we can ask graduates reasonably well about what was the most important experience you had, and if they indicate to a large extent, as they did in the Gallup Purdue alumni survey, that experiential opportunities such as undergraduate research or community-based research or an internship or a co-op were really the most beneficial experience they had in terms of their work life and well-being, then that's pretty good evidence of its enduring effect. So I think we're going to have this problem or this challenge. It's not a challenge unique to high impact practices, but it's one that I think can often stall and make our work more difficult. But I think, just to get back to my slide, I did go on there, sorry about that, is that we should be thinking more pointedly about whether and to what outcomes we want to link HIPs. And then if we should, to what extent do we want to see the effect of high impact practices on students who actually experienced them versus those who did not? That's probably our purest comparison, is to see if those students who have those experiences are different from those who do have the experience. So with that, I want to raise a couple of other points to get us a little bit deeper into this, to the questions that I want to raise, but I want to raise one of the other equity concerns that has come up in some of the literature as well, and that's some concern about a HIP critique that came through in a Critical Theory and Race Conscious Practice article that Lori Patton Davis and Sean Harper and Jessica Harris authored in 2015, a very well done study that used a critical theory approach where they raised some very important questions about and critiqued high impact practices in terms of their original design as being appealing to and advantaging white students given some of their long history, and that high impact practices might actually be perpetuating inequities in terms of promoting stereotypes about the kinds of students that should experience these things, or what kinds of students should be doing or who should be doing things like undergraduate research, and that perhaps the intensity that we expect out of high impact practices might be unfairly exposing students of color to forms of microaggression. So they raised some pretty serious concerns in their article, and I take a lot of that to heart. And we took up the challenge. I do want to respond to our study that we did on, to the extent that we could explore these questions about positive or negative effects on students of color. And in our analysis, where we did look at those populations of students, we found no evidence of systemic negative impact of HIP participation on students of color. And in fact, we found in all cases, participation was associated with positive outcomes. And we also found, just to explore a little bit about what might underlie students' the appeal of high impact practices, we found that students' expectations for high impact practices that were assessed in their first year were equal for first year students of color, similar to white students. So we did find some evidence, and if you want to read more about this, we have a paper that's available on our website to dig more into this. But I do think their concerns were sufficient enough to prompt some exploration, and I hope that more can be done to examine. But it's sure not going to only come from a survey like NSSE. I think their critique really suggests the need for more qualitative studies that are done at a campus level, and also perhaps some very specific evaluation of HIPs that I'll suggest later among students of color. So I want to summarize that I think what these two more recent critiques or questions raise is concerns both around equity and quality. And those are, those critiques really just organize our thinking around these two dimensions of the work and suggest that we need more evidence still around these two dimensions. The equity concerns come around who has access to HIPs, and are we really, when we say things are required, is it really required for everyone? If we say things are optional and are a choice of students, what do we know about those experiences? Okay, now it seems to be advancing on its own. So I want to raise, or I want to show you what some of this looks like. And again, I'm going to do this quickly just because I know many of you have seen this before or are aware of these slides, and you can have access to the slides later. But when we think about access, I've just included one slide that's specific to participation at public institutions here. And we still see some inequities around participation between public, in this case, these are public colleges and universities. So knowing that my NASH audience is composed of mostly public institutions, I just wanted to at least show you kind of where we are. And here's an interesting one. Even though learning communities overall are 13% participation, actually we see at public institutions, first year students are much more likely to experience a learning community. So you can get some feel for access. So this is just overall access at public institutions. If we look a little bit more between public and private institutions. We do see some difference as we track them in NSSE. Again, you can see them across all. We regularly publish this data. This is using our 2017 information. For some practices, we do see less at public institutions. I just illustrated the learning community one being slightly more. But then if we get a little deeper, we can see again where there are some lower levels of involvement between public and private institutions. So capstones are more widely available at private institutions. Internships, there's not much of a difference. Research with faculty, actually not much of a difference. So some interesting differences, some not so much. So again, just to kind of remind ourselves of all of these ways we can look at different participation and access data. The other population that I think is very interesting to look at are first generation status in public institutions. So these are data of first generations at public colleges and universities. We do see first generation students lagging behind their non-first generation peers, except for old service learning, where we actually see more first generation students participating. But overall, this might be a population to examine and to think about more directly is how do we assure first generation students participation levels are not less than their non-first generation peers. Internships is one that I would point out specifically, and I'm going to carry that internship theme into my next slide, where I look at internships by racial ethnic groups, again, only looking at public colleges and universities. We can see that in this case, white students participate at slightly higher levels than all other student subpopulations. So that might be a concern. Again, to look at 42% African American, not much more for Hispanic Latino students, so other groups are about the same. So again, might suggest some equity concerns around internships. And the last piece that I always like to dig into that I put on here because a couple of you asked about differences by major. We actually do a little tracking by major. This was a slide that we produced, or an image, a visual that we produced, where we tracked participation, and you can see it a little better if you go to the actual website where we featured this, but you can see that there are different participation patterns, and in terms of students participation in high impact practice based on the major that they're in. So there are distinct patterns even within majors that are interesting to track and examine across institutions. So by all means, if you're interested in the major question, I suggest you look at that site for to see the pattern for your own discipline. And then the last piece I want to draw or raise related to the access and equity is just this idea that HIPs have existed for so often on the margin. They're kind of, at most institutions, there's still more boutique experience. It's pretty rare still for high impact practices to be required of all students. So we really are still talking about experiences that are on the margin. And I think Randy Bass put it well when he was suggesting that perhaps we think about really centering these kinds of experiences and build them into the degree. I think that's a real concern. So just to quickly summarize before we get to more of your questions, I think there are some real concerns in terms of the evidence that we still need around quality and equity. Implementation is a big part of studying what works and being able to really identify the features that work and for whom. And then we need to continue to explore the real critique of the experiences of underrepresented students, particularly students of color, who might very well be subjected to negative experiences in their HIPs if they are the only person in that undergraduate research project or the only student in that internship experience. So thinking about that, and then we should also continue to examine. I have some very specific recommendations that I think are worth thinking about. Again, studying the high impact practices and the features that we know make them unique. So there's a whole bunch of evidence within the particular field. So what makes a service learning experience work and what makes it effective, in addition to assuring that the elements of high impact practices such as intensity, feedback from faculty, and that students are given real world opportunities are important. But when we think about service learning, we also know the value and importance of reflection, and that notion of reciprocity in a quality service learning experience is absolutely essential to make it valuable. So those are all the kind of quality dimensions. We also need to think about how we're scaffolding these experiences, and the effect that scaffolding experiences have on students' learning versus a one-shot, hey, that was a nice inoculation. And then we have to study just the actual HIP participation, not just availability, on the outcomes we desire. And then a whole bunch of suggestions around equity concerns related to examining HIPs by racial ethnic participation and how we might do that. And then some other issues that have a little bit more to do about the qualitative experience that students might be having. How do we better understand how students access HIPs and make it part of their lives, and the challenges that they might encounter doing the kinds of things that require that level of intensity? How can we make that jive with their lives even more seamlessly? And then what effect does that have on faculty and staff who are working with students to ensure more equity-minded practice? So I want to stop there to make sure that we have some time to get to your questions. So I'm going to, I think, turn it back to Deborah. I'm going to give up remote control there and turn it back.
That's great. Thank you. Jillian, this was fantastic information. I appreciate your focus on just that equity. Like, there's several pieces interacting at the same time. There's equity, there's quality, there's access, and then there's that implementation piece. And so what I'm going to do is just go back for a second to no, I guess I won't. The previous slide. I can't go back to the previous slide for some reason. But what I'd like you to do is think about some of the things that Jillian has talked about. And we're going to make the assumption, and you'll probably notice the methods I'm using for these breaks. It's really to get you to try to synthesize and hone in on the things that are most important for you and for your campuses as you move forward with implementing. Scaling HIPs, implementing more of them, and implementing more of them in a very deliberate, equitable, high quality way. So we're just going to make the assumption that you need more faculty to participate in the HIPs initiative on your campus, perhaps more administrator or administrative support for that. And so what I'd like you to do is use the information from that second part of Jillian's presentation to come up with a jingle that persuades them to either support, if it's administrators, or to participate. You'll remember that, okay, there's our first one, participation is pizza. Jingles might be McDonald's, you're loving it. For those of you on the East Coast, the Pep Boys, Manny, Mo, and Jack. You'll never forget that one. There are lots of jingles. So what I'm going to do is just be very quiet. And this is hard for me because there will be a vacuum of silence for a minute. But I just want you to think about, how do you synthesize the most important information, research-based, on equity, quality, access, and implementation to persuade someone to either participate in or support HIPs. And so I'll be quiet for 30 seconds. Yes, the winner has to sing, Carolyn. Okay, now they're starting to come in. I can almost hear the jingle for Alma's. I don't know. It's that's a good one. Be a swinger, be a hipster. Oh, good. Have you made a commitment to HIPS today? This is hard, isn't it? I can tell it's hard because nobody's participating. Either that or they're just saying, I can't do that. Think about it less as a jingle and maybe, I'm sorry, now it's coming in. Shake, 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 shake your hips. I wonder if that would participate or convince faculty to participate. You deserve a hip today. There we go. So what we're going to be doing now as these keep coming in, it's time, it's all in the hips, using the Happy Gilmore scene. Let's get hip. That's awesome. We're going to move to the stump the Jillian portion, and I'm having a tough time. Okay, let me just see if I can get that remote control. Hips hug, got hips. Hips deserve more than lips.
I think if we're just trying to advance the slide, that's all. If someone
yeah. There we go. Now, Stump the Jillian is here, and we have a full 20 minutes to stump Jillian. And what I'm going to do, Jillian, is I have got several questions already curated from the chat, and I'm just going to do those in order. And a lot of these were back channel. But the first one is there any questionnaire data from alumni or employers showing that HIPS did indeed prepare graduates for post-college career plans or actively helped them in their career?
Yeah, that's a good one. Certainly, employers are a good. I guess I want to think about how to characterize their who they are and what benefit they would have. Certainly, having their perspective on the value of HIPS is beneficial, and I think AAC and U's employer surveys that they've conducted over the years have at least given us plenty of evidence that employers are saying having students who have worked on a research project, students who have indicated that they have worked on a question of their own, a la undergraduate research from start to finish, that those kind of practices are valued by employers. What I don't think we have evidence of is a direct experience of a student presenting or selling a particular HIP experience that they had, whether that be a senior project and an employer kind of saying, yes, that prepared them for the work. And I don't know if we're ever going to get that. So we may just have to be satisfied with the connection that employers are identifying with students being able to talk about their work. The thing, though, that I think I want to raise instead from this question is how important it is for students to be able to know about their experience that they had in an undergraduate research or the value of the experience in internship so that they can talk about it in ways that really identify the outcomes of that experience. So the more we can do as educators to foreground what are the outcomes, what are the gains that you're making from this experience, so students become their best advocate in terms of convincing an employer that this makes a difference to their both capacity to do the work, but also ultimately their success in the organization. So I think we can do a lot more to help students demonstrate what they know, and that again, it's to me completely in line with the learning outcomes movement that we're trying to help students be better at articulating their gains. I don't think it's enough for a student just to say, oh yeah, I did a senior project, but what is it that you gained from that? What are the outcomes of that senior project? So the more we can help students be better at articulating that, I think that's critical. But I do think we have plenty of evidence that suggest employers value high impact practices and students who therefore have had those experiences.
Great, thank you. Your next question is, the bulk of data that you presented was based on self-reporting. What data do you have on student learning?
Yeah. Well, you know, one, yes, it's definitely student self-report. However, you know, I always have to find myself defending student self-report. I think when questions are well posed and students are the best position to answer questions about their own experience and about their learning, that they really can answer questions when they're posed well. So I do find that I think it's important to defend where self-report is actually the best form of evidence that we can gather about certain things. However, I will say I would like to see some more independent observations, perhaps corroborating evidence that might come from, for example, if we put up some you know, internship information, and that we can look at the quality of students' internship experience, and then look at if their internship work, something they produce, is evaluated, that we can actually see that students who had an internship and produce a quality projects, or are they're evaluated by their supervisors, their internship supervisors, in a positive way, that those students are more likely to, you know, again, pick your outcome, are graduating on time, are satisfied with their degree, are going on to graduate school at higher levels than students who don't experience an internship, or that experience an internship that is not done well. So it gets, you can hear even in how I'm, you know, with an example here, how challenging this is. So I think that if we can find and identify some demonstrations of student learning that are appropriate to evaluate, I think we can then make some connections to those bigger outcomes. But it's not an easy lift, hence why I don't think it's done that often, and we are relying more on self-reported data. But I would submit that we shouldn't devalue self-reported information, and really try and keep ourselves clear about when that is the most valuable and useful form of evidence we can garner. I would like to hear, though, perhaps in the chat, if there are some outcomes and evidence of learning that people are collecting on some high impact practices. I certainly think that the body of literature on service learning and undergraduate research has suggested that both of those practices in particular have had a strong impact on students' learning, whether that's learning how specific research skills, or if that learning is about their capacity to perform well in a subsequent research experience, that those are certainly better learning outcomes, and would expand our body of outcomes evidence than just students indicating, for example, in a self-report that they feel more confident about their skills to complete a research project. So these questions are, these are good, hard questions, but yeah, sorry for the lengthy response. Okay, someone give me an easy, short one to respond.
Okay, here's an easy, short one. What's the one hip we should study first, and why?
Oh my gosh.
You said short.
I know that's short, but it's funny.
And which one would you choose?
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, I think we have a lot of evidence about undergraduate research, and we're collecting so much more about that. That, you know, again, I don't want to stall or deflate the interests of particular individuals, but the one that I think we probably need some more evidence to move forward are the uptake, are internships, in that I think we can make internships more widely available to students. So if I think about what's the real outcome that I hope this has, is to make internships more available and to help institutions invest more heavily in helping students get internships, we might need some more evidence about the importance of internships, and then how to get more students access to them. So access might be one of the things we study, and that is, how do we help students who might be less likely to do that get access? So internships would be high on that list, but from a learning perspective, I would also like to see some of the work that's being done on signature work or culminating experience, since that's something that we could effectively embed in the curriculum. I would like to see some of that studied, of what's the effect of building in capstone and senior year projects, or signature work as it's coming to be known, into all students' curriculum, and then see if that really makes a difference. If we embed the features, make sure those are high quality experiences, does that make a difference in both student learning and their capacity beyond college outcomes? Again, wow, that's a tough question, because I think it really depends on what outcome we think is most important. If we elevate the graduation and retention rates as outcomes, I would probably go back to just kind of the broad question about any high impact practices. So if we could get study the effect of multiple high impact practices on student outcomes like graduation and retention. So if students experience 2 or 3 of these, does that make a difference? Let's get that going on campuses.
Thanks, Jillian. And that jumps to another, a related question, and there are 2 of them. One's in the chat from Linda, but then Wayne also asked about, what about other measures? So not just completion, but persistence, progress, self-efficacy. Are there any data about that? Do you have a call for further research in that area?
I'm sorry, Deborah, was that related to all high impact practices or particular?
This was related to all, but especially those, like you had hinted about it. So what do you do with the first year experience? Can you really, if it's distant from that completion goal, is there an interim goal or an interim measure that you have, such as persistence or progression, or just again that affective piece of it?
Yeah, this whole idea of trying to find outcomes that are more proximate to the experience, I think, is really important. And that might be something that institutions across the board really take up, to see if, when you're implementing HIPS, that you really are thinking about what are the outcomes that we're most likely to be able to see some change and difference on. So for first year seminars, I do think a really relevant one is retention, but I think there are also some outcomes that, for example, with first year seminar, are about students just feeling a sense of institutional commitment, and that the students feel that the institution is committed to them. That's a really important behavior, a perceptual outcome that can be measured. Belongingness is also another way to kind of capture that. So if we could look at the students who have participated in first year seminars achieving a sense of belongingness, and even if seminars are required of all students, could we examine the degree to which belongingness is experienced by all students, and if there are some gaps in terms of students who are not living on campus, or students who are first in their family might not experience as much belongingness. So then maybe the high impact practice of the first year seminar would need to be examined for what might we add, or what might we think about supplementing for students that don't readily experience the sense of belongingness that we're after from that first year seminar. So I think there's more to be done on a campus level to try and get us to closer, more proximal outcomes. So that would be my encouragement to all of you, is to really think what you're trying to achieve by implementing this. I think if we all go at it just for retention and graduation, I think we could be a little disappointed in some of the findings, just given the difficulty.
And thank you for that. We've got one question. I'm going to go off, and then I'm going to come back to the research base in just a second. But someone has asked what universities are emerging as models for directly assessing HIPS, and especially several HIPS at once, rather than focusing on just one. So do you have any effective practices or models out there?
Well, this is who will I alienate by not mentioning them if they're on the webinar right now. So I'll get myself into trouble, but I certainly think that a lot of the work that I've seen done as part of either institutions prior to their involvement with TS3, some of the work that Cal State Fullerton has been doing to track students' participation in HIPS, and other institutions that have followed suit, all the work that Kentucky and Tennessee have done to really track at a student level. I do think that there's value to tracking at a student level, and so any institution that's doing that and getting it so that they can identify on student transcripts or by whatever means works for their system, so they know exactly who has that you're setting yourselves up well to answer that question about multiple HIPs. The other, in terms of quality, I have to look at places like IUPUI that have really started to define have done a good amount of work on taxonomies and are really trying to improve the quality of the practice itself. And that's a different kind of work around high impact practices. And all of that work, I think, is just supremely difficult in terms of really assuring that the folks who have signed on to deliver HIPs are assuring quality at that level. So getting faculty to reflect on their own practice is part of data collection associated with those kind of quality taxonomies, assuring that faculty feel supported in that work. So how much support is the institution providing? Is it valued by faculty to assure that those quality dimensions are being integrated into HIPs? And then, of course, what effect does that have on students' experience? Are they perceiving those same quality dimensions, and do they feel that they're working to the benefit of those, making sure that these are high quality experiences? So, I think both sides of it need to be worked, and I think we have some good models out there. SUNY, I think, has undertaken quite a bit too. So, again, I'm going to alienate everybody I didn't mention, but, keep sharing what you're doing. But I think we need to attack, and I don't want to use a defensive word like that, but I do think we need to tackle this challenge from all of those dimensions to both examine quality and just participation. So whatever we can do to build systems to do that, we should. That's worth the investment. Thank you.
And I have only two more questions. The first one, this will please you as a researcher, is triple-barreled. So it is, it's all about the research that's out there. And the first part of the question is, do you think that people who are researching HIPs are looking for support for HIPs, or do they have a neutral mindset? That's barrel number one. Barrel number two is, do you have, are there differentiated HIPs impacts based on institutional type, size, or selectivity? And the third barrel is, are there varying levels? Like, what's the research say about varying levels or intensity? So for instance, in the chat, we're seeing things like people are coming, introducing, at least for me, the concept of high HIPs and SHIPs, or somewhat high impact practices.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those are your three barrels.
Wow. Okay.
I know.
Yeah, so good question about the, how are we approaching this research? And certainly a lot of it is, particularly around the pieces I introduced earlier, the service learning, undergraduate research, first-year seminar. That's coming from a position of advocacy and wanting to understand practices that people are directly involved in and promoting. I mean, there's no denying that the Council for Undergraduate Research is interested in promoting undergraduate research as an effective educational practice. That doesn't mean that they only publish research that is positive and supportive of it. They don't. They're at least they want to promote good research, even if it shows that undergraduate research is not benefiting in that way. But certainly a lot of that is coming from a position of advocacy. I think some of the more neutral reports, though, have been problematic, though, in this regard. If I think about a long ago learning community study that was done by a so-called, kind of neutral observer, what they didn't understand was the importance of really getting at the quality of implementation of learning communities. We all know that the quality of implementation matters. So they treated all learning communities the same, those that had just been implemented a semester ago versus those that have been going on for 15 years that have an established record of quality. So even though they were a neutral party, it became problematic in that they didn't really know the subject matter. They didn't know the importance of assuring that there was some fidelity to design. So my simple answer to that is, yeah, I think there's a lot of advocacy research that's out there, but that doesn't make the more neutral kind of work perfect in any means. The other thing is all educational research shows the conditional effects of, in this case, if we isolate it just to high impact practices, the effects of every practice is conditional, both on in terms of who the student is, where they're going to school, all of that is conditional. So high impact practices are no different in that regard. So it does matter where we study and what we study. We can't just say it's the same for everybody, every place, and for everybody all the time. The other thing is about varying levels of intensity, and I think that goes back to the quality dimensions, and that's where activities like IUPUI's attempts to really develop some taxonomies and, dare I say, standards for HIPs might be something that we think about really advocating, is having students and faculty who are implementing these come together and say, okay, this feature is implemented at a low level of quality, and that we acknowledge that the level of student faculty feedback is minimal. That's just a sacrifice we made in this, or something that we couldn't do better in this HIP, that we acknowledge those kinds of lower levels of intensity, and either talk about that in our study, or we try and address them in more of the work. But I think the intensity around all the features that matter does make a difference, and that's something that makes it, again, kind of looping back to the first question, makes it really hard to study them in total, because we need evidence about the intensity.
Thank you. And I think that's it for the Stump the Jillian. You were not successful. She had excellent answers for all of your questions. Wayne, we did
very kind, Deborah.
No, they were very good. In fact, people have already put Rebecca and Chrissy on the hook for developing an FAQ for the NASH page. Wayne, we didn't get to your question about institutions valuing HIP work in P&T decisions. So that means that you're going to have to come to the HIPs in the State Conference, which is February 20th to 22nd at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. You can visit www.wku.edu/HIPs for more information. But before we close, I always like to close webinars like this, not just leaving this information hanging there, but what will you actually do with this? So if you could please write in the chat, what is that next most important thing you will do to promote HIPs on your campus? And I mean next, like this afternoon or sometime this week. What is that in response to what you have learned today? What's one new thing that you'll do? Oh, that's interesting. California State employees. So if you could please put in the chat that next thing that you're going to do to promote HIPs on your campuses, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, if you've got any more questions for Jillian, you can put those in chat. She'll be able to see those. So far we have look up IUPUI taxonomies already done. Joan, nice check mark next to your to-do item. Try to get more faculty on board. Share additional equity measures at our TS3 meeting this week. Share taxonomies, share information with your clients. These are all excellent. So it is 2:15. Thank you, Jillian. You're just wonderful. I admire your research. I admire your inability to be stumped. And to everyone out there in the chat, thank you so much for actually taking action on all of this based on the things that Jillian has said. And thank you to NASH for hosting. And that's it. I'm going to leave the chat open for just a few minutes longer since it looks like people are putting in their action items and additional questions. But thank you, and we hope to see you all at the for the webinar series that's coming up this fall. And I can't find that now. Where'd it go? There we go. And if you'd like to join the HIPS in the State listserv, please email your request to hips@wku.edu. And again, don't forget about the upcoming webinar. And Jillian, again, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.